If you are deploying AI agents for software engineering, you're facing a critical decision. Which LLM actually delivers when it comes to real-world coding tasks? It's not about benchmarks that test basic specs. It's about actual issue resolution, front-end development, and production workflow. And the answer is not that simple. Some models are fast, but expensive. Others are cheap, but inconsistent. So how do you cut through this noise? That's exactly what the OpenHands Index solves. It's an up-to-date leaderboard that evaluates large language models across real software engineering tasks. So which models are winning? What should your teams use? What they should avoid? These are the questions on everyone's mind. That's what we are diving into today with Graham Neubig, Chief Scientist at OpenHands, on this episode of Agentic Enterprise. Graham, it's great to have you on the show.
Yeah, great to be here.
Today we are going to talk about OpenHands Index, but before that, I would love to know a bit about OpenHands, the project, the company. Just give us a quick story about OpenHands.
Yeah, so OpenHands is an open source agent for software development. If you're familiar with Claude Code, it's like Claude Code, but open source and locally deployable. You can use it with any model. It started as a community project about a year ago, and then 2 years ago, and then some of the community members kind of formed together to build a company around it, where we, help enterprises deploy it.
How old is the company and what is the reason it was created?
Yeah, so the company's about a year and a half old, and we created the company because, we were already building this project. It had a lot of momentum. People were excited about it. And basically, the CEO of the company, Robert, wanted to quit his job and do it full time. And so we formed a company so to be able to do that.
Now let's talk about the OpenHands Index. What does it do? How do you actually benchmark these LLMs?
Yeah, so one of the features of OpenHands is it's model agnostic, so we can use any model. So every time a new model comes out, our users were asking us, is this a good model? Should we try it out? Do you support it and everything? And so the OpenHands Index is a benchmarking effort that we created in an attempt to try to be able to answer this question very quickly. And there's lots of benchmarks for benchmarking software development agents. The most famous one is one called SweBench. Some people might have heard about it before. But basically what it does is it checks whether agents are able to solve issues on Python repositories, open source Python repositories. And that's great. It's a useful thing to do, but there's also a lot more to software development. So the OpenHands Index is a much broader benchmarking effort where we cover 5 different benchmarks. SweBench is one of them, but also things on front-end development, software testing, gathering information, and other things like that.
When you run these benchmarks, which models are on top? Which models are winning? What did you find?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we actually benchmark from 3 different perspectives, all of which I think are important. So the first is accuracy. Across these 5 benchmarks. The second is cost, and the third is time to resolution. And actually, the answer to that question is very nuanced, but to give a very short answer, right now the top model is Claude Opus 4.6, which is from Anthropic, and I think a lot of people are using it through Claude Code and everything. It's top both from the point of view of accuracy and speed to resolution, so it finishes issues very quickly. The only problem with it is it's very expensive. It's also one of the most expensive models, and so there's lots of other options that are pretty good but cheaper. So Gemini Flash is one of them, and then there's also open models like MiniMax, which are very, very inexpensive, less capable, but they can, you can use them as much as you want and barely put a dent in your finances.
Now, when it comes to coding, which is the favorite model? What makes it stand out?
Yeah, it's a great question. So one other feature of the index is that we kind of have different categories. So, just for kind of coding related tasks, Claude Opus is very strong. But then if you look at, for example, building an app entirely from scratch, so instead of, gradually improving an app, but you want to create a new thing, Codex actually can be better. And the reason why is because it tends to very carefully follow instructions and continue working until it's like really, really done. Whereas the Claude models still, can stop halfway through or not kind of fully finish all of your instructions. And another thing that we really focus on a lot at OpenHands is reusable workflows. So like, for example, PR reviewing, you can have an agent review your PRs, or upgrading libraries when they go out of date or things like that. And for something like that, you're going to do it over and over and over again, and you really don't need a big, powerful model like Opus. So you can go with the, less expensive open source models as well. So I think one of the biggest things that we want to get across with OpenHands Index, and you can go there, it's at index.openhands.dev, and see, is there's a lot of nuance to the answer of that question. And so like, if you want to do this thing, you might want to use this model. If you want to do this thing, you might want to use this model. And that's all supposed to be on there.
Now let's talk about one of the biggest pain points, cost. Which LLM gives users the best bang for the buck when it comes to software engineering tasks?
Yeah, so right now for cost optimization, our favorite is MiniMax, which is a open weights model that was just released pretty recently. It's the first model that we've seen that is kind of comparable with Claude Sonnet, but it's about 1/10 of the price. So it's a very good deal. There's other models that we're in the process of benchmarking right now that have also come out recently, like GLM-5, which I think will be, similarly well priced and also very capable. So the biggest thing that we focus on in the OpenHands Index is we have a figure which is like the Pareto curve of cost versus accuracy. So like, if you want a model that's this cost, then you use like this one. If you want a model that's the most capable, you use this one, and you can kind of have a spectrum on there.
What about context window, as these can impact how much you can do there? So can you also talk about which model finds the sweet spot, pricing, capabilities, and also context window?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So the context window of a lot of the recent models that focus on coding is actually pretty large. I think most of the models that are capable at coding are specifically trained to have a large context window for precisely this reason. If you don't have a large context window, it kind of falls over. On our index, we mostly focus on models that we think are going to be good because, our time is limited and we don't want to spend, our time benchmarking models that we think are not going to work. So most of the ones on there kind of meet that default criterion already. But if you want to deploy it locally, that can be a kind of a pain. You need, a big machine or something like that that allows you to handle that full context window without running out of memory. But as long as you're accessing it through an API, usually you'll be okay.
Can you also talk about how organizations actually work in real life? Do they just pick one LLM and stick with it, or they mix and match based on the task, cost, and of course, context window?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say that maybe right now, a lot of organizations are kind of focusing on one language model. And the reason why they're focusing on using a single language model is because they don't really have a good view of, okay, for this task, I can use this one. For this task, I can use this one. It actually requires quite a bit of expertise to be able to really manage that. And I feel like most organizations we talk to, especially larger enterprises, aren't quite, familiar enough yet to do that. But I see that coming in the future. It's like, okay, we're getting our deployments out. They're starting to really work. Now the next thing we want to look at is how to not, be spending millions and millions of dollars on API costs. And to be honest, the cheaper models are getting so good nowadays that a lot of the, simpler tasks that we do, really, we don't need a really expensive model. So I see a lot more of that coming in the future. And that's also what we're trying to enable.
As we have seen in the modern tech stack, developers choose the tools that they want. It's not forced onto them from the corporate board level. But when it comes to LLM, is it the same case? Do teams get to choose which models they want to use? Or it is a decision that is made, or is it a decision that the organization makes for them? They choose and say, hey, this is the model you'll be using.
Yeah, it's a great question. So some of our larger kind of customers that we work with at OpenHands are big enterprises and security sensitive ones. And in those cases, they usually have a trusted language model. It might even be one that's deployed on their infrastructure. And so they don't, kind of shop around quite as much for language models. On the other hand, we have a lot of people, for example, in our open source community who are like, a new language model comes out and it's like, I gotta try it, I'm gonna throw it into OpenRouter and like immediately, test it out. And then they're like, okay, but is this like actually the one I should be using, or is another one better, or something like that? So I see the whole spectrum basically.
How often do you update this index as new models keep coming out? How do you manage that?
Yeah, so the OpenHands Index, when a new model comes out that people are interested in, we try to support it. This is actually not the easiest thing to do because running agentic evaluations is, expensive. And we have pretty good infrastructure, but even when you have good infrastructure, each new model is kind of a unique snowflake. Like something else is different. I don't think the industry is nearly as standardized as people might imagine on, what you need to do to get a model actually working. Like a new one will add new thinking blocks or, all of these, all of these other things. And so, if everything goes well, we can try to support something in like a couple days, like a day or a couple days, because that's just the time it takes to run the index overall. But, if something breaks and we need to do a new implementation, or we need to debug why we're not getting the results we expected, then it can take a little longer.
Now you're doing all this work. How do people get access to this vast information that you are creating? What is the mechanism for them to get involved, for them to leverage it? And if you can also talk about who is using it. Let's talk about how organizations can actually take advantage of the work that you're doing.
Yeah, so I think there's all levels of how much you could use this. So like there's index.openhands.dev where we have a very high level summary that you can look at and say, okay, this is a model that has the highest cost or the best cost. This is a model that has the best accuracy. You can then click onto each of the individual use cases. So if you really want one for issue resolution, you can click onto the issue resolution use case and see what's in there, the front-end development use case and see what's in there, and other stuff like that. All of our code is open source for benchmarking, not the infrastructure code, but the benchmarking code is open source, so you can actually see what happened. And all of the results, including all of the conversations from the agents, are included on the site. So you can actually go and see for each individual example what the agent did. So depending on what level of detail you want, you can go anywhere from a very high level summary to a very low level detail of exactly what the agent did in a particular case. And organizations, I'd say one of the biggest use cases we have for it is when we talk to an organization that would like to work with coding agents like OpenHands, we show them, okay, these are the trade-offs you're making by selecting a particular model. Like, this model might be good on this use case. This model might be good on this use case. This might be the expected cost and that sort of thing. And I think that's really important as we, start moving into more model agnostic kind of pick your own model.
Based on the index and your own experience in this space, what should engineering teams be looking at when deciding which LLM to use for their agents? Of course, depending on the industry and use case.
Yeah, I'd say my initial advice is, the OpenHands Index is just meant to be a first pass. It's not your like actual use cases that you're incorporating in your, enterprise. But like, basically, you can take a first look at these sorts of benchmarking results, but in the end, it's like, is this working in deployment? Is it meeting our cost? And other, requirements like that. And in addition to the OpenHands Index, one thing that, we've been working on a bit more is kind of observability. So you can take the output of an index that you've actually, of an agent that you've actually put into production, and then, gather all of the conversations that it's had, analyze each of the conversations with a language model, and then kind of aggregate all of that, aggregate all of that information. And we're partnering with a observability platform called Laminar to do that sort of thing. And so it's like something like the OpenHands Index is your first pass, and then after you've actually deployed it, just make sure you can get visibility into what all of the users are doing. Analyze that with a language model, of course, because we can do that now, and then gradually improve your prompts, improve things like skills that are instructions on how to use an agent in a particular use case. So it doesn't start and stop with an index. It stops with deployment and monitoring and other things like that as well.
When you evaluate these models, do you also track usage patterns? Because a lot of folks feel that AI is magic, pixel dust, models are great, but the way they are being used and deployed, that's where the problem happens. People say it's not working. It's not because the car is broken. It's because you don't know how to drive. How do you track that, or do you track that at all?
Yeah, exactly. So I talked a little bit about skills, which are essentially prompts, like they're fixed prompts that you use for a particular use case. And you can do that right, and it really helps. And then there's also even some research recently that demonstrates that the skills that people are creating on real repositories are bad, and they actually hurt accuracy, and especially if you automatically generate them by agents without any sort of monitoring or stuff like that. So yeah, I think that's a huge thing. Another huge thing is context engineering. So it's like, how do you get the context that is necessary into the agents? And that's yet another thing. So no matter how good the brain is, if you don't give it the information it needs to do a good job, it's not going to do a good job.
What's next in your radar or pipeline? Everybody is using these LLMs. What's the next challenge organizations face when they deploy this model? What should you look at to help them evaluate that?
I'd say by far the number one challenge right now is verification. So like right now, code is cheap. It never was before, but now code is cheap. You can generate as much code as you want, but good code is not cheap because you need to go back and check that it actually works, it actually meets the requirements, doesn't add a whole lot of tech debt, other issues like that. And so within our pipeline, we have a few things where we're looking at that. Essentially, we've trained models to tell whether the code is going to survive into the future. So we can kind of like, before a human even takes a look at it, guess whether the code is like actually good and going to continue on later. Also, you can kind of automatically prepare your repositories so that you can verify the code that comes out using first just unit tests and static analysis, like the standard tools that people always use before, all the way to these sorts of like AI code review or AI prediction of code survival and things like that as well. So that's what we have in the future. It's kind of separate from the OpenHands Index, but we're going to merge them together soon, I guess.
Graham, thank you for joining me and breaking down the OpenHands Index. It's clear that choosing the right LLM for software engineering isn't just about raw performance. It's about balancing cost, task, specific strength, and real-world deployment results. Thank you for sharing those insights, and I look forward to our next conversation. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thanks so much. This was a great experience.
And for those watching, if you are deploying AI agents or trying to figure out which LLM makes sense for your teams, please make sure to check out OpenHands and OpenHands Index at openhands.dev, and don't forget to subscribe to TFIR, like this video, share it with your teams, and thanks for watching.